Welcome back to the conversation in News Central Television. The first half of the show, we did talk about President Ramaphosa surviving an impeachment vote in Parliament. It's now time for us to switch gears and still stay in Southern Africa. This time in Zimbabwe, where the son of Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa is set to be the latest to be added to the United States sanctions list for corruption and human rights abuses. President Joe Biden's administration slapped the corruption sanctions on Emmerson Mnangagwa Jr. on the eve of the U.S.-Africa summit in Washington, D.C., after identifying him as the one in charge of his father's business interests related to a businessman accused of corruption. The United States Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control announced that it was adding for Zimbabwean people and two companies that are linked to prominent businessman Kudakwashe Tagwire and his Secunda holders, both of which are already on the United States sanctions list. President Mnangagwa and scores of other ruling ZANU-PF officials, as well as security chiefs, are targeted by the sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe over 2 decades ago over alleged human rights violations, corruption, and electoral fraud. Now, joining me live from the Zimbabwean capital, Harare, to discuss this, I have Earnest, Mudzengi, a political commentator. Thank you very much for joining the conversation, Earnest.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening to viewers and listeners.
Thank you, Earnest. Now, Earnest, what's your reaction to the U.S. government's sanctions on the president's son, Emmerson Mnangagwa Jr.? How much effect would it have on him and Zimbabwe in general?
Yeah, the issue of these sanctions has been topical recently. And one idea that seems to be going around is that these sanctions, or the so-called targeted sanctions, are not having much effect on the so-called targeted individuals. Rather, they are having an effect on the ordinary citizens in that they have become an excuse by the ruling elites when they fail to provide for basic services. For example, as I speak, most parts of the capital, Harare, are without water, and this has been so for the past month or more. We are without potable water, and one of the reasons that is cited by government officials as to the cause of the problem are these sanctions or the targeted
so sanctions have become the boogeyman. You know, it's easy for the government to say, look, things are not working because it's because of sanctions. Now, what has been the official response from the government of Zimbabwe to this latest round of sanctions?
Obviously, the government hasn't said much so far that I have heard of, but obviously their reaction is that they will simply report about this, and then they will use the latest development to bolster their claim that it is because of sanctions that the economy is in doldrums.
Now let's look at what the Americans are saying. Washington is saying that tightening the sanctions regime, this so-called targeted sanctions, was meant to encourage behavioral change on the part of the Zimbabwean government. Earnest, have you seen a behavioral change from the Zimbabwean government since the times of Mugabe to Emmerson Mnangagwa? How effective have these sanctions been in forcing about a positive change and behavior from the government of Zimbabwe?
If you look at it, these measures have been in place for almost 20 years, but we haven't seen much of change. In fact, the reason why they are imposing more measures is that the measures have not been really successful in terms of exerting behavioral change. So people are now worried, and they are suggesting that why not lift the measures so that we see if there are going to be there is going to be economic recovery or otherwise.
Yeah, because you've been doing the same thing over and over again, and we're not seeing any change. So let's try something different for once. That brings me to this question, Ernest. Critics of sanctions often say it's collective punishment for all Zimbabweans, and you've said that the government uses it as a convenient get-out-of-jail-free card. What are some of the effects on the ordinary people of Zimbabwe, this U.S. sanctions, and what is your own personal opinion on sanctions?
When you look at the ordinary person, like I have already said, government has a ready excuse when it fails to offer basic services. You look at our health system; it has almost collapsed. And when you appeal to government will say we are under sanctions. Look at the transport system; it has collapsed. Government will say this is because of sanctions. So the ordinary person is now suffering under the smoke screen of these targeted measures. And I would think it wise that there be a revision of a strategy. In fact, rather than adding more people to the list, I would think that maybe there is a need for change so that we see whether or not the economic will recover if sanctions are lifted.
Now, Ernest, what's the opposition's position on sanctions, the CCC and other opposition parties? What's their take on this sanctions regime?
Yeah, obviously, there are different sentiments from different opposition political parties. Other opposition political parties are saying the sanctions are not good, they should be lifted. Others are saying what should be done is that we must have reforms rather than simply calling for sanctions removal. Why not reform first and then you see what happens? So some are saying what is important is the road to the removal of the sanctions, which must be reforms. While others are saying there must be an unconditional removal of the targeted measures.
Now, Ernest, President Ramaphosa of South Africa said Zimbabwe's neighbors, such as South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, were being overwhelmed by the influx of Zimbabwean economic migrants and argued that Harare's problems were induced by the sanctions. I mean, this is not President Mnangagwa saying this. These are his SADC neighbors. How big of a problem is this? And would you say sanctions from the United States on Zimbabwe were the biggest contributory factors to this surging Zimbabwean economic migrants around the SADC region?
Yeah, I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier, that sanctions have provided a ready excuse for government. We don't know whether they are failing or whether they are succeeding. But they will readily say that this is because of sanctions. So when you talk of people leaving the country owing to economic problems, the government will simply say they are leaving because of problems that have resulted from sanctions. So, it then becomes a chicken and egg thing. So what some are suggesting, I know people like journalists have actually suggested that the targeted measures be lifted so that we are exposed to the actual realities pertaining to the economic situation in this country. So what we are saying is, if people are moving to South Africa, obviously President Ramaphosa will be worried. If people are moving to Botswana, President Masisi and the people of Botswana will be worried about the influx of Zimbabwe. But now, when we now want accountability, government has a ready excuse. It will say that this is a result of sanctions.
Now, President Mnangagwa has been pushing for the lifting of sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe since taking over from long-time ruler Robert Mugabe following a military coup in 2017. But the United States government insists that Harare is not doing enough to warrant the lifting of the embargo. What does Harare really need to do to have these sanctions lifted? What should the government of Zimbabwe do to make the United States satisfied and say, okay, let's take off the sanctions? So, and of course, like you said, ordinary Zimbabweans also want to see that there's no ready excuse. Yes.
I will tackle it, among other things, from what the Americans who have imposed the target measures are saying. Initially, if you look at it, I think just after the land reform program in Zimbabwe, the land redistribution exercise, the issue of land was being cited. But when you look at what is going on now, I think we are also having a narrative to do also with corruption being put at the fore. So the issue here is that the measures remain in place because of corruption, because of human rights abuses, because of absence of economic reforms, and so on and so forth. And when you look at it, there is indeed need for corruption to be fought more effectively in this country. There is a need for reforms, especially pertaining to ensuring that the laws of the land are in line with the current constitution of the country, especially with respect to the Bill of Rights. The laws must not contribute to human rights abuses.
Okay.
So those are some of the issues that are there when you look at reality, and one would say that government has to attend to such issues, making sure that our laws are in line with the constitution, making sure that corruption is effectively combated.
So if they do both, then the United States might be compelled to lift sanctions on Zimbabwe. But President Mnangagwa's administration accuses the West of pushing the embargoes to, of using the embargo to push for a regime change agenda. He claims they don't like him, they want him out of government, so they're using sanctions to force him out of government. What do you make of this? Do you think it's in the West's interest to have President Mnangagwa out of office, or is it making a mountain out of a molehill?
I wouldn't speak for the West, but what I can say is that that claim is part of government's counter narrative on the issue of sanctions. So we are saying that because of sanctions, government has been able to develop these narratives. So why not take the excuse away from government, and then we see if the economic situation will improve. What we as Zimbabweans are worried about are the problems that are besetting us, and we would want sustainable and realistic solutions to the problems affecting the country. That's what the ordinary Zimbabweans like myself want. We want to be lifted out of these problems, and we want sustainable solutions. We are tired of propagandistic narratives. We are tired of excuses and so on and so forth. We want the country's problems to be resolved, and we are saying that maybe one way towards that is to remove these targeted sanctions as a way of ensuring that there are no more propagandistic abuses to a situation which might be maybe one of economic mismanagement.
Now, finally, Earnest, before I let you go, in late October, Zimbabwe's ruling party, ZANU-PF, endorsed President Emmerson Mnangagwa as the sole candidate ahead of next year's polls. What's your assessment of the democratic space in Zimbabwe as we inch towards the 2023 elections?
Yeah, obviously, ZANU-PF has a right to endorse Mr. Mnangagwa as his candidate. That's their purview as a political party. But we as citizens, pertaining to prevalence of democracy in this country, would be more worried about electoral reforms that are outstanding. For example, we want in this country a voters' roll that is more accessible. For example, we want the electoral commission, the election management board to be independent. We want the elections, you know, to be more friendly, to be violence-free, to be intimidation-free. We want a situation where people are actually helped to register to vote, not a situation where voter education is a preserve of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. Why not extend it to other civic organizations that operate more independently?
And civil society organizations too. Thank you very much, Earnest Mudzengi, political commentator, joining us live from Harare, Zimbabwe. It was a pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, this is where we draw the curtains on today's edition of The Conversation. In the first half, we did look at the situation in South Africa, where President Ramaphosa survived an impeachment vote, and we just concluded our conversation. And the United States imposing sanctions, targeted sanctions on 4 Zimbabwean individuals, including the president's son, Emmerson Mnangagwa Jr. Thank you very much for being a part of the show. I'll be with you next time on The Conversation. Bye-bye.